My knees were shaking as I, Sophia Reynolds, age 28, walked into the imposing courtroom clutching a manila folder of documents that could change everything. When my parents spotted me from their seats at the defendant's table, they exchanged glances and rolled their eyes in that dismissive way I'd known my entire life. That familiar gesture, the one that had always made me feel small and insignificant, sent memories flooding back of every time they discounted my feelings, my talents, my very existence. But then something unexpected happened. Judge Marshall looked up, noticed their reaction, and his eyes narrowed with interest. "Miss Reynolds," he said, leaning forward. "I believe you have something important to share with this court today. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. If you've ever had to stand up to family who didn't believe in you, hit that like button and subscribe right now. Trust me, you'll want to stick around to see how this story unfolds when someone finally decides to listen to me for the first time in my life." Growing up in the Reynolds household meant living in a perpetual state of invisibility. My parents, Victoria and Richard Reynolds, weren't just wealthy, they were titans of industry who viewed everything through the lens of status and achievement. Our sprawling Connecticut estate with its manicured gardens hosted charity galas and business functions, but never children's birthday parties or art shows. From my earliest memories, I knew that my interests didn't align with their vision. When I was 7, I spent hours creating a watercolor painting of our family. My mother glanced at it for merely seconds before saying, "That's nice, Sophia, but shouldn't you be practicing your piano? The Whitfield children all play instruments." My painting ended up in the trash when they thought I wasn't looking. By age 10, my bedroom was filled with sketchbooks I had to hide under my mattress. Art was considered a hobby in the Reynolds household, something to mention casually at dinner parties but never to take seriously. "Creatives are always struggling," my father would announce at family dinners. "True success comes from business acumen." Meanwhile, my older brother Nathan was the golden child. 3 years my senior, he embraced our parents' values without question, excelling in economics, joining the debate team, and eventually attending my father's alma mater, Princeton. "Why can't you be more like your brother?" became the soundtrack of my adolescence. The pattern continued throughout my teenage years. When I was 16, my art teacher, Miss Harding, entered one of my paintings in a statewide competition without telling me. It won first place. The awards ceremony was scheduled on a Thursday evening. "We have the Andersons charity gala that night," my mother said, when I finally worked up the courage to tell them about my achievement. "You understand, don't you, dear? Networking is essential for your future." I stood alone on that stage accepting my award while other parents beamed and took photos of their children. Miss Harding squeezed my shoulder afterward and whispered, "Your talent is exceptional, Sophia. Don't let anyone dim your light." But at home, the award certificate was merely acknowledged with, "That's nice, dear," before being tucked away in a drawer. My parents controlled every aspect of my life, from my education to my social circle. When college applications came around, I desperately wanted to apply to Rhode Island School of Design. "Absolutely not," my father declared. "You'll major in business at Columbia, like we discussed." The discussion had been entirely one-sided, but arguing was pointless. Their financial control was absolute, and they never hesitated to remind me of it. College became a study in quiet rebellion. I dutifully attended business classes during the day, but at night, I took art classes at a local community center, paying with waitressing tips I saved. I graduated with the business degree they wanted, and they proudly displayed my diploma in the study right next to Nathan's. The corporate job they arranged through family connections at Reynolds Markham Financial was soul-crushing. I spent my days analyzing spreadsheets and preparing presentations while my true self slowly withered. At night, in my tiny apartment, the only independence I'd managed to negotiate. I painted until the early hours, creating the vibrant, emotional pieces no one would ever see. 3 years into this half-life, I accidentally discovered something that would change everything. While gathering documents for a family foundation report, the Reynolds Arts Education Foundation, ironically established by my grandfather to support arts in underprivileged communities, I noticed financial discrepancies. Large sums were being transferred to offshore accounts. When I cross-referenced dates, I realized these transfers coincided with my parents' extravagant purchases, their vacation home in the Maldives. My mother's rare art collection, the irony wasn't lost on me, my father's vintage car restoration. They were embezzling from a foundation meant to give arts education to underprivileged children. The very thing they denied me, they were now denying to countless others who had far fewer opportunities than I'd had. That night, I didn't sleep. By morning, I knew I could no longer live with myself if I remained silent. Despite a lifetime of having my voice dismissed, I would need to find the courage to speak up even against the two people who had mastered the art of silencing me. The decision to leave Reynolds Markham Financial wasn't made in a single moment, but through a series of small acts of courage. First, I stopped answering my parents' calls every single time they rang. Then, I began looking for apartments farther from their influence, eventually finding a small studio in Brooklyn that I could barely afford. When I gave notice at work, my supervisor handpicked by my father looked stunned. "Your father won't be pleased," she warned. "I know," I replied, feeling something unfamiliar in my chest, the lightness of making my own choice. Moving day arrived with a torrent of calls from my parents, which I ignored until settled in my new place, a fifth-floor walk-up with questionable plumbing but glorious natural light, perfect for painting. "This is ridiculous, Sophia," my mother snapped when I finally answered. "That neighborhood isn't safe. You're throwing away everything we've built for you." "I need to do this," I said, surprised by the steadiness in my voice. "Your trust fund access requires our approval of major life decisions," my father reminded me coldly. "Remember that." I had remembered it and had withdrawn most of my accessible funds before telling them my plans. It wouldn't last long, but it bought me time. My neighbor Ellie became an unexpected ally in my new life. A kindergarten teacher with a passion for photography, she recognized my isolation and simply decided to adopt me into her life, inviting me for coffee, introducing me to her friends, and eventually becoming the first person to see my paintings. "These are incredible," she said, studying a canvas of a young girl standing alone at an awards ceremony. "You should be showing these somewhere." Her encouragement led me to a small community art show where Marcus Garcia, owner of Prospect Gallery, happened to be in attendance. He approached me afterward, business card extended. "Your work has something special," he said. "Raw emotion balanced with technical skill. I'd like to see more." While my artistic life was cautiously blooming, I hadn't forgotten about the foundation discrepancies. Working nights and weekends, I meticulously traced financial records, comparing foundation expenditures against arts programs that were supposed to be funded. Many had been cut due to budget constraints that didn't seem to affect my parents' lifestyle. I created spreadsheets documenting years of suspicious transactions, gathered copies of foundation, mission statements, and grant applications that were denied while funds disappeared. The picture became increasingly clear and increasingly damning. After 2 months of investigation, I consulted a lawyer, Diane Park, recommended by Ellie's cousin. I brought my documents to her small office, nervous about being dismissed yet again. "These are serious allegations," Diane said after reviewing my evidence. "Especially given the foundation's nonprofit status and stated mission. This isn't just unethical, it's potentially criminal." "They're my parents," I said, feeling the weight of what I was considering. "Yes, and that makes this incredibly difficult," Diane acknowledged. "But if what these documents suggest is true, they've stolen educational opportunities from countless young people who had no other options." As if sensing my resolve was forming, my parents intensified their efforts to regain control. My mother showed up unannounced at my apartment, aghast at my living conditions. "This is why you need us, Sophia," she insisted, looking around with thinly veiled disgust. "You clearly can't make sound decisions for yourself." My father took a different approach, calling with a job offer. "Executive position at the foundation," he said smoothly. "The board would approve it immediately with my recommendation. Excellent salary, company car, housing allowance. The position would place me directly under his supervision while creating the appearance of success and independence. More importantly, it would give them control over what I knew about the foundation's finances." "I need time to think about it," I said, recognizing the manipulation tactic. "Don't take too long," he replied. "This opportunity won't wait forever." The threat was clear: get back in line or face consequences. When I didn't immediately accept, the pressure escalated. My trust fund access was suddenly under review. Old family friends stopped returning my calls. Nathan called to express concern about my mental health, a conversation that felt suspiciously rehearsed. Through it all, I continued gathering evidence and painting at night to stay sane. The decision to formally file a complaint against my parents came after discovering a particularly heartbreaking detail. A music program in Harlem that would have served over 200 children had been denied funding the same month my parents purchased a third vacation property. "I need to do this," I told Diane, sliding the final documentation across her desk. "Not just for me, but for all those kids." As she prepared the legal filing, I felt terrified but also something I hadn't experienced before, the quiet certainty of standing on solid moral ground. The backlash began precisely 43 minutes after my parents were served with legal papers. My phone exploded with notifications, first my brother, then aunts, uncles, cousins, family friends. The Reynolds dynasty was closing ranks. Nathan's call was the most difficult. We'd never been close, but the hostility in his voice still cut deeply. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" he demanded without preamble. "Do you have any idea what you've just done to this family?" "They've been stealing from the foundation," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Money that was supposed to help kids get arts education?" "Oh, spare me the sanctimonious crap," he interrupted. "You're just doing this for attention. You've always been jealous of how successful they are, how successful I am." "That's not true," I protested, but he was already launching into threats. "You'll be cut off completely. No family, no connections, no financial support. Is that what you want? To be completely alone?" The call ended with him promising I would regret this decision for the rest of my life. Similar conversations played out with other family members. My mother's sister accused me of being mentally unstable. My father's brother called me disgracefully ungrateful. Second cousins I barely knew posted social media comments questioning my motives and character. Only Aunt Catherine, my father's elderly aunt who had always been considered the family eccentric, reached out differently. Her text simply read, "You're braver than anyone gives you credit for. Call me when you can speak freely." When we met for tea the following week, she revealed she'd had suspicions about the foundation for years, but had been systematically excluded from family financial discussions. "Richard and Victoria have always been obsessed with appearances," she said. "The foundation was Howard's legacy," she added, referring to my grandfather. "He truly believed in making arts education accessible to all children. He would be devastated by what they've done." Her support was comforting, but couldn't shield me from the broader campaign my parents were orchestrating. They hired a prominent PR firm to handle the unfortunate family situation. Carefully worded statements began appearing in business publications and social circles, suggesting I was struggling with emotional issues and had misinterpreted standard foundation operations due to my limited financial expertise. The strategy was clever. They expressed concern rather than anger, positioned themselves as worried parents rather than accused embezzlers, and subtly undermined my credibility without making direct accusations that could be legally challenged. My professional network, largely built through family connections, rapidly disintegrated. Former colleagues stopped returning emails. Invitations to industry events mysteriously disappeared. One former mentor actually crossed the street to avoid speaking to me. The financial retaliation came swiftly. My trust fund access was completely frozen pending mental health evaluation. My health insurance still on the family plan was canceled. The landlord of my apartment building received an anonymous tip about unauthorized commercial activity, my painting, resulting in a lease violation notice. Within weeks, I was facing eviction with rapidly dwindling savings. Ellie immediately offered her couch until I could find another solution. "This is what friends do," she insisted when I tried to refuse. "Besides, I'm investing in your future famous artist career." But the most chilling development came in the form of anonymous messages suggesting my parents' influence extended far beyond what I'd imagined. A note slipped under my door read simply, "The Reynolds family has friends everywhere. Reconsider while you still can." A blocked number texted, "Ask yourself if any judge in this city would rule against your father." When my car's brake line was found damaged during a routine service, Diane insisted on documenting everything. "This pattern of intimidation strengthens our case," she assured me, though I could see concern in her eyes. There were moments, alone at night on Ellie's couch, when I nearly gave up. The weight of standing against my entire family, against the wealth and connections they wielded so effectively, felt impossible to bear. The path forward seemed to lead only to more loss, more isolation, while the path backward, dropping the case, begging forgiveness, returning to the fold, promised immediate relief from the pressure. I was closest to surrendering when Diane called with news that changed everything. Another Foundation employee had come forward with corroborating evidence after reading between the lines of the carefully worded public statements. "You're not just fighting for yourself," Diane reminded me. "You're fighting for every child who lost an opportunity because of what they did." That night, I painted until dawn a canvas filled with dark shadows pierced by persistent threads of light. It wasn't beautiful, but it was honest, and it reminded me why I couldn't back down now. My life had narrowed to survival mode, sleeping on Ellie's couch, picking up graphic design freelance work wherever I could find it, and preparing for the legal battle ahead. The isolation imposed by my family's influence was so complete that when Marcus Garcia from Prospect Gallery called, I initially assumed it must be bad news. Perhaps he too had been pressured to cut ties. "I've been thinking about your work," he said instead, "and I'd like to offer you a spot in our Emerging Artists exhibition next month." I nearly dropped the phone. "Are you sure? There's been some controversy around my family situation." "I don't care about family drama," he interrupted. "I care about authentic art that moves people. Yours does that. Are you interested or not?" This unexpected lifeline came just when I needed it most. Working frantically to prepare enough pieces for the exhibition gave me purpose beyond the legal case. Each painting became an act of defiance, proof that I existed outside my parents' definition of me. The opening night exceeded all expectations. Despite my fears that my parents' influence would result in an empty gallery, the space was packed. Art critics from local publications attended. Several pieces sold, providing financial breathing room for the first time in months. Among the attendees was Rachel Kim, a journalist who approached me toward the end of the evening. "I'm working on a story about arts education funding," she said, handing me her card. "Specifically, foundations that aren't fulfilling their stated missions. I'd love to talk sometime." Our coffee meeting the following week revealed she'd been investigating several family foundations, including the Reynolds Arts Education Foundation, long before my legal action. Her research had uncovered patterns of suspicious financial activity, but hit roadblocks when trying to access internal documents. "Your case could blow this wide open," she explained, "not just for your family's foundation, but potentially for others operating similarly." Through Rachel's network, I connected with former foundation employees who had questioned practices but feared retaliation if they spoke out alone. Their statements provided additional evidence of systematic fund misappropriation stretching back years. Most powerfully, Rachel introduced me to families whose children had been directly affected by the foundation's broken promises. Miguel Alvarez, a 17-year-old music prodigy from the Bronx, had been promised a scholarship for specialized training funding that mysteriously disappeared. His mother had kept every letter, including the final rejection, citing budget limitations, sent the same week my parents purchased their yacht. "He plays whenever he can borrow instruments," his mother told me, showing videos of Miguel performing with remarkable skill on borrowed equipment. Imagine what he could do with proper training. Meeting Miguel and others like him transformed my understanding of what was at stake. This wasn't just about my personal grievance with my parents, it was about tangible harm done to real people who had counted on the foundation's mission. The most surprising ally emerged when Nathan appeared at Ellie's apartment unannounced one evening. His normally confident demeanor was absent as he asked if we could talk privately. "I found something," he said once we were alone, pulling out a flash drive. "I was looking through Dad's home office for something else, and came across these files." The drive contained emails between our parents discussing foundation funds as if they were personal accounts, explicitly mentioning using the money for their Aspen property renovation and mother's jewelry collection. "I didn't want to believe you," Nathan admitted, unable to meet my eyes. "It was easier to think you were being dramatic or vengeful. But this, I can't ignore this." "Will you make a statement?" I asked, hardly daring to hope. He hesitated. "I need time. This changes everything I thought I knew about them." As Nathan wrestled with his loyalty conflict, my parents attempted one final strategy, a settlement offer delivered by their attorney. In exchange for dropping all claims and signing a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, they would restore my trust fund and provide a generous consulting fee for my discretionary use. The amount was substantial enough to fund my art career independently for years. The temptation to end the fight, to escape the pressure and uncertainty, was powerful. That same afternoon, I received a voice message from Miguel Alvarez thanking me for listening to his story. "No one ever fought for us before," his voice said simply. I called Diane and declined the settlement offer. 2 days later, we learned Judge Marshall had been assigned to the case, a judge known for his strict ethical standards and immunity to social pressure or political connections. When my parents discovered this news, they made their first significant misstep, attempting to have their social connections influence the court assignment, an effort that was not only unsuccessful but was documented and added to our case file. The day before the first hearing, I encountered my parents outside the courthouse during a preliminary meeting. My mother looked through me as if I were invisible. My father made a show of checking his watch impatiently. Their message was clear. I was an inconvenience they would soon put in my place. But something had changed in me over these months of struggle. Their dismissal no longer crushed my spirit. Instead, it strengthened my resolve to finally be seen and heard, if not by them, then by the justice system and everyone watching. The courthouse loomed like a limestone mountain, its classical columns and broad steps designed to intimidate. Inside, our footsteps echoed on marble floors as Diane led me to courtroom 3B, where our case would be heard. My hands trembled slightly as I clutched my portfolio of evidence documents that represented not just financial fraud, but my entire journey of finding my voice. The courtroom itself was imposing rich wood paneling, flags flanking the bench, the state seal mounted prominently behind where Judge Marshall would sit. The gallery was already filling with journalists, law students, and curious onlookers drawn by the high-profile names involved. My parents were already seated at the defendant's table, looking impeccable as always. My mother wore a conservative navy suit that probably cost more than 3 months of my rent. My father adjusted his gold cufflinks, a nervous habit I recognized from childhood. Despite their confident postures, this slight tell suggested they weren't as composed as they appeared. Their attorney, Thomas Wells, was legendary in corporate law circles, known for aggressive tactics and an undefeated record defending wealthy clients against financial impropriety claims. The $1,500 per hour legal team surrounding him created a stark contrast to our side of the courtroom, where only Diane and I sat with our carefully organized but modest materials. "Don't be intimidated by the theatrics," Diane whispered. "Wells relies on overwhelming the opposition. Judge Marshall cares about facts, not flash." When the bailiff called for all to rise, Judge Marshall entered, a tall, distinguished black man with silver-streaked hair and penetrating eyes that seemed to assess everything without revealing his thoughts. After the formalities of opening court, Wells immediately moved to have the case dismissed. "Your Honor, this is a regrettable family disagreement that has no place in your courtroom," he began smoothly. "Miss Reynolds has misinterpreted standard philanthropic practices due to her limited financial experience. Her claims are without merit and waste the court's valuable time." Judge Marshall listened without expression, then turned to Diane. "Counsel for the plaintiff?" Diane rose calmly. "Your Honor, we have documented evidence of systematic financial fraud involving millions of dollars diverted from a nonprofit foundation established to provide arts education to underprivileged children. This isn't a family squabble, it's a clear case of embezzlement with real victims." The judge studied both attorneys, then said, "I'll hear preliminary evidence before ruling on the motion to dismiss." As Diane presented our initial documentation foundation mission statements, alongside financial records showing diverted funds, I watched Judge Marshall carefully. Unlike so many authority figures in my life who had barely glanced at my evidence before dismissing it, he studied each document thoroughly, occasionally asking precise questions that revealed his deep attention to details. "And these transfers to Cayman account CR 7892, can you demonstrate the ultimate destination of these funds?" he asked at one point. Diane directed him to evidence showing the transfers coordinating precisely with the purchase timeline of my parents' Maldives property. Property records confirm the final sale date exactly 3 days after this particular foundation withdrawal, Your Honor. Throughout this presentation, I could feel my parents' mounting tension. My mother's perfectly manicured nails tapped silently against the table, my father's jaw clenched repeatedly. They had clearly expected a quick dismissal, not this level of scrutiny. Our first witness was Harold Winters, the foundation's accountant who had initially flagged concerns about financial irregularities before being pressured to ignore them. "Mr. Winters, could you explain the standard procedure for approving foundation grant expenditures?" Diane asked. There's a formal review process involving the board of directors, he explained. At least 3 board members must approve any grant above $10,000, and full board approval is required for amounts exceeding $50,000. And was this procedure followed for the transactions highlighted in Exhibits A through G? Harold adjusted his glasses nervously. No. Those transfers were executed under direct instruction from Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds, bypassing normal approval channels. During Wells's aggressive cross-examination, he attempted to portray Harold as a disgruntled employee with personal grievances. Isn't it true you were passed over for promotion 3 times, Mr. Winters? Might that color your testimony against the Reynolds family? Objection. Assumes facts not in evidence, Diane interjected. Sustained, Judge Marshall ruled, giving Wells a warning look. Counsel will refrain from character insinuations without supporting evidence. Throughout the day, I noticed Judge Marshall watching not just the witnesses but also my parents' reactions. When evidence was presented showing funds diverted from a Harlem Youth Orchestra program to coincide with my mother's art acquisition, I saw his eyes narrow at her dismissive eye roll. By late afternoon, Wells's confidence had visibly diminished. His objections became more frequent but less effective, as Judge Marshall consistently ruled in favor of allowing our evidence to be presented in full. The day concluded with Judge Marshall denying the motion to dismiss. Based on preliminary evidence, there are substantial questions that merit full examination. This court will proceed with hearing the case in its entirety. As we gathered our materials, I caught Judge Marshall studying my parents, who were huddled with their legal team looking uncharacteristically concerned. For the first time, I realized they might actually face consequences for their actions. This is just the beginning, Diane cautioned, as we left the courtroom. They'll come back harder tomorrow. But Judge Marshall is seeing through their facade, and that's exactly what we needed. Outside on the courthouse steps, a small group of former foundation grant applicants had gathered with handmade signs reading, "Art is not just for the wealthy," and "Where did our grant money go?" Their presence reminded me that this fight was far larger than my personal vindication. That night, I barely slept, replaying the day's events and preparing for what would come next. The battle had truly begun, and for once, someone in authority was actually listening. As the court proceedings entered their second week, the emotional toll became increasingly difficult to manage. Each day meant facing not just legal challenges, but the piercing reality of my parents' betrayal laid bare in public record. Evidence mounted showing they had systematically diverted funds for years, treating the foundation as a personal account, while arts programs serving thousands of children went underfunded or were eliminated entirely. Nights became a struggle between exhaustion and insomnia. When sleep did come, I had recurring nightmares of standing in empty courtrooms, screaming evidence that no one could hear. I'd wake, gasping, disoriented in the darkness of Ellie's living room. "You need to find better balance," Ellie insisted one morning, finding me reviewing case notes at 5 a.m. "This case is important, but you can't let it consume everything else in your life." She was right, though finding that balance seemed impossible. The case had become my identity, my purpose, my entire focus. Everything else, including my art, had been pushed aside by the all-consuming legal battle. That evening, instead of reviewing more documents, I set up a small painting station in the corner of Ellie's living room. The blank canvas stared back at me like a challenge. For nearly an hour, I couldn't make a single stroke, paralyzed by the disconnect from this vital part of myself. Finally, I closed my eyes and remembered Miguel Alvarez playing his borrowed violin, the pure expression in his face as music flowed through him. I began painting without planning, letting emotion guide my hands. What emerged was a piece unlike anything I'd created before, darker, more complex, raw with pain but threaded with unexpected light. I painted through the night, losing myself in the process. By morning, I'd completed 3 canvases that felt more authentically mine than anything I'd ever created. They weren't beautiful in any conventional sense, but they were true expressions of grief, betrayal, and the complicated journey towards self-liberation. Marcus visited later that week, reviewing these new works with thoughtful silence before saying, "This is what I've been waiting to see from you. Your technical skill was always evident, but these have soul. The struggle has transformed your art." He arranged for these pieces to be included in a group show titled Emergence, focusing on artists breaking through personal barriers. The opening coincided with growing media attention around our case, creating an unexpectedly powerful synergy. Rachel Kim's first major article was published in The Atlantic, detailing the foundation's misappropriations alongside stories of the young artists' denied opportunities. Public reaction was immediate and overwhelmingly supportive. Social media campaigns emerged with hashtags like Art for All and Justice for Young Artists. Several prominent arts organizations issued statements condemning the foundation's practices. This groundswell of support helped counter the isolation my parents had engineered. New connections formed with artists, educators, and advocates passionate about arts accessibility. For the first time, I felt part of a community that valued exactly who I was. The case itself continued to advance despite Wells's increasingly desperate procedural maneuvers. Each day in court revealed new dimensions of my parents' financial misconduct, with Judge Marshall maintaining his careful attention to every detail presented. Throughout this period, Nathan's position continued to evolve. After discovering the incriminating emails, he'd maintained cautious distance from both sides of the conflict, struggling with divided loyalties. We met occasionally at a coffee shop far from family haunts, his expression perpetually troubled. "They're claiming you fabricated evidence," he told me during one such meeting. "But I've seen the original documents. I know you didn't." "Will you testify?" I asked again. He stared into his coffee. "They're our parents, Sophia." "Yes," I agreed. "And they raised us to know right from wrong. What they did was wrong, Nathan. All those children who lost opportunities." "I need more time," he said, but I could see the conflict deepening in him. As public opinion shifted increasingly against my parents, they attempted to arrange a private settlement meeting. Their offer had doubled from their previous proposal, now including a foundation board position for me, a transparent attempt to both silence and control me simultaneously. "Consider what continuing this will do to the Reynolds name," my father argued, "the first time we'd spoken directly in months. To your future. To Nathan's future." "I'm not concerned with the family name," I replied. "I'm concerned with the foundation's mission and all the children who were harmed." "You always were too idealistic for your own good," my mother said dismissively. "This self-righteous crusade won't end well for you." I left the meeting with their offer firmly rejected, which triggered their most aggressive counterattack yet. Anonymous sources began feeding stories to tabloids questioning my mental stability. Old acquaintances suddenly remembered concerning behavior from my college years. A particularly vicious piece suggested my art career was failing, driving me to seek revenge against my successful family. The intensity of these attacks left me reeling. In a moment of despair, I called Dr. Sharma, the therapist I'd begun seeing to help manage the stress. "They're trying to destroy me," I said, voice breaking. "Maybe they're right. Maybe I should never have started this." "Sophia," she said firmly, "this reaction from them just confirms how threatened they feel by the truth. These attacks aren't signs of their strength, they're evidence of their desperation." That perspective shift helped me weather the storm. So did throwing myself back into painting, which had become essential therapy. Working through my emotions on canvas provided clarity I couldn't find elsewhere. One painting in particular, a young girl standing tall amid circling shadows, became unexpectedly significant. Titled simply "Standing," it was featured in local arts coverage and eventually purchased by an anonymous buyer. Only later did I learn the buyer was Judge Marshall's wife, an arts educator who had seen it during the Emergence exhibition. As the case advanced toward its conclusion, I found myself transformed in ways I hadn't anticipated. The painfully shy, easily intimidated person I'd been seemed like a stranger now. In her place was someone who could speak confidently in court, who understood her own worth was not determined by parental approval, who recognized that authentic expression, whether through legal testimony or artistic creation, was the path to freedom. This transformation was noticed by others. "You carry yourself differently now," Ellie observed one evening, "like you finally know who you are." That night, working on a new canvas, I realized she was right. Through this painful journey, I'd finally discovered my voice in art, in justice, in life. Whatever the court ultimately decided, that discovery could never be taken from me again. The case had been grinding forward for nearly 4 months when the unexpected breakthrough occurred. Court had just reconvened after lunch when Diane received an urgent text message. She quickly scribbled a note and passed it to me. "Gerald Hoffman just arrived. Former Reynolds financial advisor. Says he has critical evidence. My heart raced. Gerald Hoffman had managed my parents' personal finances for over 15 years before abruptly retiring 2 years ago, an exit that had always seemed suspicious given his relatively young age and passion for his work. Wells was in the middle of questioning a foundation board member about standard operating procedures when Diane approached the bench to request a brief recess. Judge Marshall, noting her unusual interruption, granted 15 minutes. In a small conference room, Gerald Hoffman waited nervously, a leather portfolio clutched in his hands. He looked significantly older than I remembered, his hair now completely gray, deep lines etched around his eyes. "Miss Reynolds," he said, standing as I entered, "I should have come forward sooner." "Why now?" I asked, torn between gratitude and wariness. "I've been following the case coverage," he explained. "I always suspected, but seeing the evidence presented, I can't keep silent anymore." He opened his portfolio. "I have documentation your parents don't know I preserved. Explicit directives for fund transfers between foundation accounts and their personal expenses." When court reconvened, Diane immediately called Gerald Hoffman to the stand. My parents' shock at his appearance was unmistakable. My mother actually gasped aloud, while my father's face drained of color. Wells leapt to his feet. "Objection. This witness wasn't on the plaintiff's list." "Your Honor, Mr. Hoffman came forward voluntarily during the recess with highly relevant evidence," Diane explained. "We had no prior knowledge of his intention to testify." Judge Marshall studied the situation carefully. "I'll allow preliminary questioning to determine relevance. Proceed with caution, counselor." What followed was devastating to my parents' case. Gerald methodically outlined how he had been instructed to create complex financial pathways to obscure the movement of foundation funds into personal accounts. He produced copies of emails, transaction records, and even handwritten notes from my father specifically directing foundation money toward their Aspen property renovation, luxury vehicle purchases, and my mother's extensive jewelry collection. "Mr. Hoffman, why did you leave your position with the Reynolds family?" Diane asked. "I raised ethical concerns about these practices," he replied quietly. "I was told my services were no longer required and given a significant severance package contingent upon signing a non-disclosure agreement. Yet you're testifying today, potentially violating that agreement. Why?" He looked directly at my parents. "Because some things matter more than money or legal agreements. The truth matters." Wells attempted to discredit Gerald through aggressive cross-examination, suggesting financial motivation or personal vendetta, but Gerald remained composed, his testimony unwavering. Judge Marshall appeared particularly interested in the documentation, requesting that certain exhibits be enlarged on the courtroom screens for closer examination. My parents' faces reflected growing alarm as their carefully constructed defense crumbled. Their whispered conversations with Wells became increasingly agitated. For the first time, I glimpsed genuine fear in their expressions. The day's final bombshell came from an entirely unexpected quarter. During the afternoon break, Nathan approached me in the hallway, his expression resolute despite his obvious tension. "I'm going to testify," he said simply. "I can't sit back anymore. What they did was wrong." When Wells learned of Nathan's intention, he immediately sought a private conference with my parents. Their heated discussion, though muffled behind closed doors, was clearly contentious. When they emerged, my father's face was flushed with anger, my mother's eyes rimmed red. The following morning, Nathan took the stand. The gallery hushed as he was sworn in, the dramatic tension of son testifying against parents drawing even greater media attention. My parents stared at him with expressions mixing disbelief and fury. "Mr. Reynolds," Diane began gently, "could you describe your role in the family business and foundation?" "I've been executive vice president at Reynolds Markham Financial for the past 4 years, Nathan replied, his voice steadier than I had expected. "I serve on the foundation board, though my role has been largely ceremonial." "When did you become aware of financial irregularities within the foundation?" Nathan glanced briefly at our parents before answering. "I had suspicions for several years but dismissed them. I didn't want to believe my parents capable of such actions. It wasn't until I discovered documents in my father's home office that I had concrete evidence." He proceeded to outline additional transactions I hadn't even been aware of, including a pattern of falsified board meeting minutes, creating the illusion of approval for diverted funds. With each revelation, Judge Marshall's expression grew increasingly grave. During a brief recess, my father confronted Nathan in the hallway, grabbing his arm. "You, ungrateful." "Mr. Reynolds!" Judge Marshall's voice cut through the tension. He had exited his chambers just in time to witness the altercation. Any attempt to intimidate witnesses will result in contempt charges. Return to the courtroom immediately. This public rebuke seemed to shatter something in my father's carefully maintained facade. When proceedings resumed, his customary poise had vanished. During Wells's increasingly desperate attempts to salvage their defense, my father interrupted repeatedly, his comments becoming more hostile and uncontrolled. "This is absurd," he finally exploded after particularly damning evidence was presented. "I built that foundation. The money is mine to allocate as I see fit." Judge Marshall's gavel cracked sharply. "Mr. Reynolds, control yourself or you will be removed from this courtroom." The outburst proved pivotal, revealing the entitlement underlying my parents' actions more clearly than any evidence could have. Several jurors visibly reacted, exchanging glances that suggested the defense had lost any remaining credibility. As court adjourned that evening, Judge Marshall made an unusual announcement. "Given the volume of evidence still to be considered and the importance of this case, I'm calling for a special evening session tomorrow to continue proceedings without interruption. This court will reconvene at 7 p.m. Outside the courtroom, media coverage had exploded, with the family drama aspect unfortunately overshadowing the substantive issue of arts education funding. But Rachel Kim's consistent reporting maintained focus on the true victims' children denied opportunities because of my parents' actions. That night, looking out from Ellie's apartment window at the Brooklyn skyline, I felt the momentum had finally, irreversibly shifted. After a lifetime of being dismissed, of having my voice silenced and my perceptions questioned, the truth was emerging with undeniable clarity. Whatever happened next, that truth could never be buried again. The courthouse looked different in evening light shadows stretching across the stone steps, the interior lighting creating an almost theatrical atmosphere. Security was heightened for the special session, with additional officers posted throughout the building due to increased public interest. The gallery filled quickly, forcing latecomers to stand along the back wall. Judge Marshall entered precisely at 7 p.m., his demeanor suggesting the unusual timing reflected the seriousness with which he viewed the proceedings. "This evening's session will continue without breaks until all remaining testimony has been heard," he announced. "I expect professional conduct from all parties." His pointed glance toward my father made clear that yesterday's outburst would not be tolerated again. My parents sat rigidly beside Wells, their typical confidence notably diminished. My father's hands fidgeted constantly with his tie. My mother's perfect posture seemed forced rather than natural. Diane had saved my testimony for this critical juncture. As I was sworn in, I felt strangely calm months of fear and uncertainty crystallizing into perfect clarity about what needed to be said. "Miss Reynolds," Diane began, "please describe for the court your first discovery of financial irregularities within the foundation." Methodically, I walked through my initial findings, the mismatched numbers, the strange timing of transfers, the pattern that emerged when comparing foundation expenditures against my parents' luxury purchases. I explained how arts programs serving underprivileged communities were systematically defunded while foundation money flowed to offshore accounts. "To be clear," Diane asked, "approximately how much foundation money do your records indicate was diverted to personal use?" "Based on the documentation I've gathered, at least $8 million over the past 5 years," I stated. "Possibly more in earlier years, though those records were harder to access." Judge Marshall leaned forward. "And what specific programs were denied funding as a result?" This question allowed me to highlight the human cost music education in Harlem schools, visual arts programs in South Bronx community centers, dance training for talented but economically disadvantaged students. For each program cut or reduced, I could name a corresponding luxury purchase by my parents. The foundation was established by my grandfather specifically to provide arts opportunities to children who would otherwise never experience them, I explained. He believed art wasn't a luxury, but a necessity for full human development. The Foundation's mission statement explicitly states this purpose. Throughout my testimony, I avoided looking directly at my parents, focusing instead on presenting evidence clearly and unemotionally. Only when Diane asked about personal impact did my composure waver slightly. "Why did you decide to come forward with these allegations?" knowing the personal cost would be significant. I paused, finally turning to face my parents. Because the truth matters more than family loyalty when that loyalty requires participating in harm to others. Every dollar diverted from the Foundation's mission represented a child whose potential was stifled. I couldn't remain silent once I understood what was happening. Wells's cross-examination was aggressively personal, designed to portray me as emotionally unstable and vindictive. Isn't it true that you've always resented your parents' focus on financial success? That you've consistently rejected their guidance in favor of impractical artistic pursuits? Objection, Diane interjected. Relevance? I'll allow limited questioning along this line, Judge Marshall ruled, but counsel should focus primarily on the financial evidence. I've always had different interests than my parents, I acknowledged. But this case isn't about personal disagreements. It's about documented financial fraud and the misuse of charitable funds. Wells attempted to undermine the documentation, suggesting I lacked financial expertise to properly interpret complex transactions. Isn't it possible you've misunderstood standard philanthropic accounting practices? The documents speak for themselves, I replied steadily. Transferring foundation money designated for children's music programs directly to accounts that paid for personal vacation properties isn't a matter of interpretation, it's misappropriation. When Wells pressed on my artistic career, implying financial desperation motivated my claims, Judge Marshall finally intervened. Counsel, focus on the financial evidence or conclude your cross-examination. Following my testimony, Nathan returned to the stand to provide additional details about foundation operations. His insider perspective proved particularly damaging to our parents' defense, especially his account of board meetings where funding decisions were manipulated. Grant applications were pre-selected before meetings even occurred, he testified. Programs my parents didn't personally value were never seriously considered, regardless of merit. Meanwhile, administrative expenses grew exponentially with no actual increase in services provided. My parents' mounting desperation manifested in a final desperate attempt to discredit both of us. During questioning, Wells suddenly introduced childhood psychological evaluations, suggesting I had attention-seeking tendencies and difficulty distinguishing fantasy from reality evaluations from when I was 11 years old, seeing a therapist briefly after struggling to adjust to a new school. Objection. Diane's voice rang out. These ancient childhood records are completely irrelevant to the financial matters at hand. Judge Marshall's response was immediate and severe. Objection sustained. Mr. Wells, this court will not entertain character assassination based on childhood psychological evaluations. Such tactics reflect poorly on your client's case. The strategic miscalculation backfired spectacularly, creating visible sympathy for me among court observers. Even some of Wells' junior associates looked uncomfortable with the tactic. As the evening progressed, our final witness took the stand, Aunt Catherine, who had maintained her quiet support throughout the proceedings. Though elderly and using a walking cane, her spine was straight and her voice clear as she detailed decades of questionable financial practices within the Reynolds family. Howard, my brother and Sophia's grandfather, established that foundation with the clearest of intentions, she testified. He grew up in poverty with no access to arts education, and its absence haunted him his entire life. When he achieved financial success, providing such opportunities to disadvantaged children became his passion. She described watching as my parents gradually took control after my grandfather's death, systematically redirecting the foundation's focus from its original mission. The changes were subtle at first, but the pattern became clear. Programs serving truly disadvantaged communities were first reduced, then eliminated entirely. Meanwhile, the foundation increasingly funded programs at prestigious institutions where Victoria and Richard could network with social elites. Her testimony provided crucial historical context, establishing that the pattern of misappropriation wasn't a recent development, but a systematic betrayal of my grandfather's legacy spanning many years. As the clock approached midnight, Judge Marshall finally called an end to testimony. This court will recess until 10 a.m. tomorrow, at which time closing arguments will be presented and I will render my decision. The courtroom emptied slowly, reporters rushing out to file late-night stories. As I gathered my materials, I caught my mother watching me with an unreadable expression, something between fury and, perhaps for the first time, a glimmer of respect. Outside in the cool night air, Ellie waited with a thermos of tea. "How did it go?" she asked anxiously. "I think," I said slowly, "that for the first time in my life I was actually heard." That night, I slept deeply and dreamlessly, the exhaustion of months of struggle finally catching up with me. Whatever the judge decided, I had spoken my truth completely. No one, not my parents, not their expensive lawyers, not their social connections, had been able to silence me this time. The person who walked into court the next morning was not the same one who had begun this journey with shaking knees and doubting heart. I stood taller now, my voice steady, my conviction unshakable. The truth had been revealed, and in that revelation, I had finally found myself. The courtroom was filled beyond capacity for Judge Marshall's ruling. Journalists packed the gallery, sketch artists captured the scene from the front row, and a line of people unable to find seats stretched down the hallway. The case had captured public attention, not just for its family drama, but for the broader questions it raised about philanthropy, privilege, and accountability. My parents arrived with their full legal team, projecting confidence despite yesterday's devastating testimony. My mother nodded curtly to acquaintances in the gallery while my father conferred with Wells, their expressions suggesting they still believed their position and connections would ultimately protect them. When Judge Marshall entered, the room fell instantly silent. He carried himself with quiet dignity, taking his time arranging papers before addressing the courtroom. His first words set the tone for what would follow. "This court has considered all testimony and evidence with great care," he began. "The issues before us are not merely technical financial matters, but questions that strike at the heart of philanthropic responsibility and public trust." He methodically outlined the evidence presented, noting the overwhelming documentation of systematic fund misappropriation and the clear pattern of deliberate deception. His summary was precise and damning, leaving no room for ambiguity about his findings. The Reynolds Arts Education Foundation was established with a clear charitable purpose, providing arts education to underprivileged children who would otherwise lack such opportunities. This mission was explicitly stated in founding documents and publicly proclaimed in all foundation materials. The evidence conclusively demonstrates that Richard and Victoria Reynolds violated this mission, their fiduciary responsibilities, and ultimately, the law. As he continued, my mother's composed facade began to crack. My father sat perfectly still, as if movement might draw further attention to his mounting disgrace. "This court finds in favor of the plaintiff on all counts," Judge Marshall declared. "The defendants are hereby ordered to repay all misappropriated funds to the foundation, with interest, totaling $12,342,000. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the courtroom. The amount was even larger than our estimates, suggesting Judge Marshall had included transactions beyond those we'd documented. But he wasn't finished. Additionally, the court orders the following remedies. First, Richard and Victoria Reynolds are permanently removed from all foundation positions and prohibited from serving on any nonprofit board for a period of 10 years. Second, the foundation will be restructured under independent oversight to ensure proper governance moving forward. My parents' faces had gone completely pale. The financial penalty was substantial but survivable for them. The public removal and ban from nonprofit boards struck at the heart of their social standing and carefully cultivated philanthropic image. Finally, Judge Marshall continued, given her demonstrated commitment to the Foundation's original mission and clear understanding of ethical governance, the court recommends that Sophia Reynolds be appointed to the restructured Foundation Board to help restore its intended purpose. I sat in stunned silence as Diane squeezed my hand. This unexpected vote of confidence from the court was vindication beyond anything I'd imagined possible. Judge Marshall concluded with words that would be widely quoted in subsequent media coverage. "Philanthropy without integrity is merely public relations. Charitable foundations exist to serve their stated missions, not to enhance the lifestyle or social standing of those who control them. This court's ruling aims to restore both the foundation's resources and its original purpose of bringing arts education to those who need it most." The aftermath unfolded rapidly. Media coverage was immediate and extensive, with headlines emphasizing both the financial fraud and the public service aspect of the ruling. My parents issued a terse statement through their PR firm, accepting the verdict while characterizing the misappropriations as administrative oversights rather than deliberate fraud. Nathan approached me outside the courthouse, awkwardly extending his hand before shifting to a brief hug. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "I should have supported you sooner." "You came through when it mattered most," I replied, recognizing how difficult his testimony against our parents had been. "That's what counts." The foundation restructuring process began immediately, with a court-appointed transition team reviewing all operations and grant processes. When they formally invited me to join the new board 2 weeks later, I accepted with a clear vision for restoring my grandfather's legacy. My first board meeting was surreal, sitting at the head of the table in the foundation's conference room, where I'd once been barely acknowledged as a visitor. The new board members, selected for their expertise in arts education and nonprofit governance, brought fresh perspectives and genuine commitment to the mission. "Our first priority must be restoring programs that were defunded," I stated during our initial planning session. "There are children who've been waiting for opportunities promised to them." Within 6 months, we had reinstated music education in Harlem schools, reopened visual arts programs in the Bronx, and established new dance training scholarships for economically disadvantaged students. Miguel Alvarez received the full scholarship he'd been promised years earlier, along with a stipend for the professional quality violin he'd never been able to afford. My relationship with my parents evolved in unexpected ways. The initial aftermath was predictably hostile. They refused all contact, instructed family members to choose sides, and attempted, unsuccessfully, to appeal the court's ruling. But time gradually shifted these dynamics. My father reached out first, almost a year after the verdict. Our coffee meeting was awkward and brief, but it opened a door to limited communication. "I still believe we were entitled to use those funds," he maintained stubbornly. "But I never intended to hurt you personally." It wasn't an apology, but it was an acknowledgement. My mother took longer, eventually sending a stiff note congratulating me on a successful gallery show that had received positive reviews. Neither interaction suggested deep reconciliation, but they represented small steps away from complete estrangement. Nathan and I rebuilt our relationship more substantially. Freed from our parents' influence, we discovered genuine common ground and mutual respect that had been previously impossible. He eventually joined me on several foundation initiatives, applying his financial expertise to ensure transparent governance. My artistic career flourished alongside my foundation work. The authenticity that had emerged through my personal struggle translated into increasingly powerful paintings. Marcus arranged a solo exhibition titled Reclamation, featuring work created throughout my journey from silenced daughter to empowered advocate. Opening night of that exhibition, 1 year after Judge Marshall's ruling, served as a perfect culmination of this chapter in my life. The gallery was filled with supporters who had stood by me through the darkest times: Ellie, Diane, Rachel, Miguel, and other scholarship recipients, foundation colleagues, and fellow artists. Even Aunt Catherine attended despite her increasing frailty, beaming with pride. "Your grandfather would be so proud," she told me, gazing at a painting that depicted a young girl stepping into light from shadows. "Not just of what you accomplished with the foundation, but of who you've become." As I looked around the room at my art on the walls, at the vibrant community that had formed around restoring the foundation's mission, at the faces of young artists who would now have opportunities my grandfather had envisioned, I felt a profound sense of completion. The journey had begun with my parents rolling their eyes as I entered a courtroom, dismissing me as they had my entire life. It had culminated in this moment of authentic self-expression and purposeful service, a life aligned with my own values rather than dictated by others. The following week, the foundation welcomed its first full class of scholarship students to the newly established Reynolds Arts Education Center. Watching these young people, many from circumstances my grandfather would have recognized from his own childhood, discover their artistic voices was the most meaningful reward possible. One young girl, hesitant at first to even pick up a paintbrush, gradually created a vibrant landscape that expressed her unique vision. Her transformation from uncertainty to confident self-expression mirrored my own journey. "This is just the beginning," I told her, recognizing in her eyes the same spark my grandfather had sought to nurture through his foundation. "Your voice matters. Your art matters." And in that moment, the circle felt complete. Have you ever had to stand up to your family for what's right, even when it felt impossible? I'd love to hear your experiences in the comments below. If this story resonated with you, please hit that like button and subscribe to my channel for more stories about finding your voice and standing up for what matters. Share this video with someone who might need encouragement to speak their truth. Sometimes knowing we're not alone makes all the difference. Thank you for joining me on this journey, and remember, your voice matters, no matter who tries to silence it.